I chose a very poor time to join the army. The plan was to join the army as an engineer, serve for a few years, then use the money and skills I'd build up to open an auto repair shop over. I signed on for a 6-year minimum contract, but then 2 years in, Australia got involved in Vietnam. We'd had advisors in before that, working to train up the South Vietnamese, but no one expected it to escalate in such a way. I certainly didn't, anyway. And if it did, I thought being an engineer would keep me out of harm's way, for the most part at least. But oh, how wrong I was. In late 1967, I was summoned to the office of my company commander, and when I arrived in his office, he had a sheet of paper in front of him. He gave me a look over, then asked me if I was indeed just 5 foot 5 inches tall and 70 kilos. I told him yes, that I'd always been short and skinny, but that I'd passed all the relevant army tests as well as meeting all the minimum height and weight requirements. And that's what I thought it was about. You see, I got it into my head that they were trying to kick me out because of my smaller stature. It turns out that quite the opposite was true. The army wanted men of my size very badly indeed, and that's because of a very special kind of job that only we could perform, a job that would earn us the name tunnel rats. Along with about 100 other guys, I was sent back to the Army School of Military Engineering near Sydney, where we underwent a 3-month crash course in what was called tunnel clearance. To counter the threat of air power, the Vietnamese communists had taken to living underground as a means of avoiding detection. It was such an effective technique that our ground forces were forced to come up with a means of flushing them out. We tried everything: grenades, dogs, tear gas. The Yanks even tried flooding them with water at one point. But the only thing we sent down those holes that was really effective were people. And to fit down there, you needed to be short and skinny, just like I was. We crawled through a few replica tunnels the instructors had built, but the meat and potatoes came down to the kind of combat we were told to expect. Most of the fighting in Vietnam was in really dense jungle, and from a lot of the stories I heard, you rarely got a look at the Viet zone during a firefight. But in the case of us tunnel rats, we would be getting up close and personal with the enemy, so close you could touch them, in fact. More often than not, you had no choice but to lay hands on them because the fighting down in those tunnels was quite literally hand-to-hand. You went down into the tunnels with a handgun, a flashlight, and a knife, sometimes a rope to tug on if you needed help, but that's about it. You could use the handgun if you really needed to, but shooting in such a dark and enclosed space could really mess up your eyes and ears, so it was always a last resort kind of thing. The enemy tended to just flee if they knew we were in the tunnels, and we'd post blocking forces to try and cut off their escape. But every so often, you had to get your hands dirty. Ideally, you wanted to sneak up on a bloke, clamp your hand over his mouth, and stab the Jesus out of him before he knew what was happening. That way, you could either keep going or go back to warn the rest of your mates without the enemy knowing you were there. But after a while, the enemy got wise to what we were doing, and they really wanted to take us out of the game. They started building booby traps into the walls of the tunnels, mostly things like tripwire grenades. But some tunnels had false walls or floors where the Viet could hide before plunging a bamboo spear into our bellies. There was even one instance where an American tunnel rat claimed to have found a booby trap consisting entirely of live snakes. The had dug out a little hole in the bottom of one tunnel, then tossed some highly venomous pit vipers in there. There were even mouse or rat droppings dotting the little enclosure where they had clearly been feeding them rodents to keep them alive. They started doing a lot of that sort of thing after the tunnel clearance program really got going, just baiting us sometimes so they could kill our blokes. We heard that a Viet zone got a big-time reward for killing a tunnel rat, and rightly so. It wasn't like you could train any soldier to do the job. The army only had a finite supply of smaller, skinnier soldiers blokes, and the more we lost, the more strain the job put on you. We were also faced with a massive problem when it came to taking casualties. 90% of the time, if the Viets got the better of a tunnel rat, he was a goner. But we couldn't just leave the bodies down there, we had to recover them. The same thing applied if a bloke was wounded, we had to send another man down there to drag them out. This was obviously very dangerous, as the Veets were experts at setting traps and ambushes. So, trying to rescue one guy might result in 2 or 3 other tunnel rats being killed or wounded in the process. And that's how I ended up buying my ticket home in June of 1969. Me and another tunnel rat we called Victor were flown from our base at Nui Dat to a place called Kawachai. We'd be joining the 5th Battalion of the Royal France Regiment for what they were calling Operation Esso, which amounted to a month's worth of mine disposal and tunnel clearance in the area of Kawachai. We worked staggered shifts in teams of 2, and that day was our day, so off we went. The moment we landed, some infantry sergeant ran up to the helicopter and told us we were needed at a tunnel system about 2 kilometers from the landing zone. They had been mapping out the tunnel system for weeks, making a note of all the entrances they could find. They weren't easy to locate either, being these small holes with wood panel covers that were very easily concealed. Anyway, they mapped out the tunnels, put a few blocking forces in place, and all we needed to do was flush out the Viet Somme so the other platoons could pick them off. When we arrived at the entrance the sergeant wanted us to start with, Victor told me he wanted to be the first one in so he could at least get a feel for the place before we both went down together, if it even came to that. He went down, rope tied around the hand, holding his pistol with him, and said that he'd be back in a few minutes. But then a few minutes went by, and there was no sign of Victor. As you can probably imagine, the rope that he held kept extending and extending as he moved forward, so we knew everything was A-okay. Every so often, the rope would stop for a few seconds where Victor was just waiting and listening or checking out his surroundings, I assume, but it would always start moving again in a moment or two. But then it stopped and didn't start moving again. After I gave the line a few tugs and Victor didn't tug back, I really started to worry. I tried my best to wait a few minutes before heading down. I hadn't heard any gunshots or anything that might indicate he was in trouble, but him being so still for so long wasn't a good sign. After a minute or so ticked by and there was still no movement, I got down into the tunnel myself to check on Victor. Generally speaking, there were 2 kinds of tunnels here. The larger tunnels connected all the various underground facilities the Viet Somme had down there. They had field hospitals, armories, even bloody classrooms so their leaders could indoctrinate them with all that bloody Marxism stuff. But then there were the smaller tunnels, the kind closer to the surface where you literally had to crawl along on your belly to get anywhere, and it was this kind that I found myself in that morning. It was pitch black, and I didn't need to use my flashlight. All I had to do to find Victor was follow the rope he was holding. So, that's what I did, moved as quiet as a mouse, just hoping I wasn't about to crawl into a trap. Eventually, after a couple of minutes of crawling, I felt my hand touch the bottom of Victor's boot. I stayed quiet as I gave it a nudge, but Victor didn't move. He was dead, probably killed by some Viet Somme who then ran off to warn his mates. If that was the case, then job done, the blocking forces could do their thing. It just seemed unfair that the result came at the cost of my mate's life. To make sure that there was nothing restricting Victor's body before I tried to pull it out, I switched on my flashlight to take a look around. The smaller tunnels were tiny, but there was just about enough room to lift your head up a little bit. That way, I could use my flashlight to look ever so slightly over Victor's body. But when I did, it resulted in the single most heart-stopping moment of terror I had ever experienced. I didn't get a good look at the bloke, I didn't have time, really. But when I switched on my flashlight, there was this Viet Somme on the other side of Victor's body, and he had a pistol aimed right at my flashlight. I dropped down straight away, trying to get as low as possible. The guy must have shot where the light was, and I know I must have blinded him a bit, so his first few shots went over me. I know this because I felt the earth hitting the back of my neck from where the Viet Somme's bullets were smashing into the tunnel ceiling. The noise was deafening, well and truly, and as much as I saw the flashes from where he kept on shooting at me, I didn't really hear the shots, not properly, anyway. The only thing that kept his bullets from killing me was Victor's body, and if he wasn't dead when I found him, it certainly was by the time it came to dragging him out. The guy shooting at me quickly extended his pistol clip and had to back out of the tunnel to rearm. When I carried on dragging Victor's body the opposite way, I could hear the bloke shouting for his friends in Vietnamese, and I knew it was only a matter of time before more bullets came flying in my direction. All I could do was focus on dragging Victor, telling myself I still might be able to save his life if I just get him out of that bloody tunnel in time. I could hear the rest of my mates shouting on the surface. They'd heard the gunfire and were willing me to drag myself out of the tunnel in one piece. I almost made it out without a scratch too, but as I reached the tunnel entrance and raised myself up to climb out, I heard another round of muffled gunfire before a bullet smashed into my left knee. I know it belongs to get themselves shot, and because of all the adrenaline, they don't feel a bloody thing unless it breaks a bone or something. Jesus Christ, the pain I felt when my kneecap shattered into a dozen little pieces was like nothing I'd ever felt before or since. If it wasn't for the guys who grabbed me under the armpits and dragged me out of that hole, I might have already lost one or both legs to a spray of Chinese-supplied bullets. Like I might have already said, that bullet wound was my ticket home. I was flown back, stitched up, put into a rehab program, and then I was back on duty. Thankfully, I didn't have to go back overseas, but I did serve about 18 more months teaching tunnel rats how to do that job. That was near the end of my first tour of Iraq, from November 2006 to August 2007. It was July. We were RVing with Iraqi police, with the majority of our platoon sitting idle in the surrounding area on our M1151S. In the distance, we heard a few shots of small arms fire, which our second lieutenant wanted to investigate. I was the driver to the second squad leader in Spartan 2, and we generally took the lead with us. Our platoon, which was undermanned with 2 squads instead of 3 or 4, rolled out with 2 additional Iraqi army trucks and 2 Iraqi police trucks towards the suspicious gunfire outside the main village. There was a cluster of buildings, like a mini village, with one dirt and gravel road about half a mile long, with a drainage ditch on the left and a canal on the right. This is where leadership failed on a few counts. First, air drone recon was called and responding, yet we did not wait for recon to proceed. Second, dirt and gravel roads are avoided as much as possible because of the ease with which IEDs can be placed and hidden. Third, a secondary road was located but had clearly been intentionally blocked, making the main road suspicious and even more dangerous. Lastly, upon proceeding down the road, the Iraqi police escort claimed that we were going into an Al-Qaeda stronghold and promptly abandoned the convoy, which was ultimately ignored by the 2LT. An Iraqi army Humvee took point next to my truck, and another Iraqi truck with the remaining 7 US trucks proceeded down this road. Roughly halfway down, the lead truck stopped for some reason without radio contact. We had no idea why until I moved to the side a bit and saw a ditch across the road blocking safe passage forward. My squad leader got out to get some word with the Iraqis ahead and immediately jumped back in his seat. At that same moment, we came under small arms fire. He jumped back in, yelling about being shot at. Outside my driver's window, I saw 3 men pop up from tall grass about 50 meters directly beside my truck, firing AKs. My gunner called out a bongo truck to the frontier of the village with a mounted dushka, which is like a huge Russian version of a .50 cal. This was a typical L-shaped ambush, and I was front and center. No way forward, left, right, nor hasty retreat. Taking small arms and now heavy machine gun fire, my gunner engaged the bongo truck, and I could see the M240 turret kicking up dust around the 3 engaged on my left. I just sat there, unable to defend myself. Then came a bang, a flash of fire and smoke. I thought it was an IED. I felt a pinch on my left cheek and touched it, drawing back a heavily bloody glove. I slapped it back on and applied pressure, training kicking in immediately. I called out to the squad leader, "I'm bleeding," while I wondered if I was dying since I felt no pain. Unbeknownst to me, the time the fire suppression system had activated, the heavy gas made her voice sound super low, like the opposite of helium. It was like a movie betrayal in slow motion, and my senses were all messed up. I had enough of sitting there in the kill zone and started to reverse. The Iraqi truck behind me didn't get the hint until I rammed him about 2 or 3 times. Finally, we began to back slowly away, which isn't easy on a narrow road with one hand on the wheel, with only a single side mirror. No backup mirror, and the passenger side mirror was blocked from view. At some point, the medic had run up to my truck from about 3 back to jump in mine under fire. We managed to move the convoy far back enough that my squad leader could drive and the medic could tend to me. We eventually moved off the road and headed back to base while I sent up my own 9-line media on the Blue Force tracker. After being seen by medics and being flown by Blackhawk to Ballot Medical, I learned that I wasn't hit by an IED. The Dushka had penetrated the armor of my truck above the windshield, ricocheting off the roll bar beside my head, and finally breaking apart, spraying shrapnel across my face. A few inches and I could have had a stump where my head was. The PTSD is an SOB still to this day, and the VA says I'll most likely never be free of it. I haven't told my story to many people except for my wife and a few other of my close friends. It happened while I was stationed in the Army as a radio operator during the Vietnam War, and I haven't forgotten it to this day. I was a young recruit, freshly drafted out of high school, and I didn't know much about the war. I had no idea what I was getting into or what it was all for, but what I did know was that I had a duty to my fellow servicemen. We arrived on a Friday evening and got loaded onto many buses to be taken to our barracks. The air was very humid, and the soil was soaking wet due to a storm that had just passed through the area. I vividly remember the drive and how it stunk like sewer. My first night was uneventful and quiet, but we all felt the tense atmosphere as our drill sergeants taunted us with stories during BAS training. I remember the half moon right over my head, which kept peeking out from over the clouds, and all of us were just sitting around telling jokes. I was more of a technical guy and didn't have much aptitude for comedy, so I just listened in. My duty was to manage communications between my unit and all of our other guys so that everyone knew what was going on everywhere else. I carried a box on my back, which were the size of radio devices back then, and also a ton more equipment and supplies. I was quickly assigned to a tight-knit unit who had just lost their communications operator to a landmine, and I remember the first time we made contact with the enemy. It was the loudest thing I ever heard. We were in a dense part of the jungle and couldn't see the enemy at all, but we quickly ducked as soon as they began firing at us, and we opened fire in their general direction in return. The chaos seemed to last forever, and we probably ceased fire after a couple of minutes. We advanced forward to close in on the enemy and secure the area, and it was the first time I ever saw the enemy up close. There they were, 3 dead Viet Cong soldiers laying in a pool of their own blood. I couldn't believe that I was looking at 3 human beings that were alive just moments ago, young guys who maybe had sisters or brothers and parents. They were probably just chilling around moments before we arrived, and here we are moments later looking at their motionless bodies. But I must say that I felt justified because they were the enemy, and they would have been standing over our dead bodies instead. A few days later, we got assigned to a different location which saw heavier casualties and needed more support. I grew accustomed to the violence and saw many of our young men die painfully. One day, I was told by my NCO that someone wanted to speak with me. I was greeted by an older man in his late 50s who looked totally out of place. His demeanor was calculated and predictive, and even my commanding officer seemed to have turned into a yes man in front of him. He introduced himself as RCK Henry, an intelligence officer stationed nearby, and said that I was going to be assigned to him as an RTO for his unit. I liked my unit and wanted to stay with them, but orders are orders, and I had no choice. So I got on the Huey and went with him. We landed in a heavily wooded area next to a few Viet Cong huts. It was heavily built up by the enemy, and I could definitely imagine the fight that must have taken place here. There were some guys who had gas masks on and others standing nearby, but they didn't seem to notice me or even care that I was there. It was a very strange atmosphere that didn't feel quite right. These guys didn't act like normal soldiers and definitely didn't have the look of fear in their eyes as most of us did. I even tried to talk with some of them, but all I got was a strange, emotionless glare like they were infected with something. Whatever it was, they all had it, and it made me feel very uneasy. Officer Henry and I entered one of the smaller huts, and I was told to stay put until someone would come and get me. I should have just stayed there and waited, but I was too curious and apprehensive to relax, so I made my way out towards the main tent and took a peek inside. What I saw made my stomach drop like it never had before. On a makeshift table lay 6 murky containers. Each one of them had a severed head of a guerrilla fighter inside, with several tubes and wires protruding from them. A green liquid seemed to be reacting with the heads as their mouths and eyes were quivering like they were half alive. I suddenly felt a hand grab onto my shoulder. It was Intelligence Officer Henry, and he looked very upset. I meekly asked what they were doing inside there, but he angrily said that I should not have gone in there and sent me back to my hut. We must have been attacked or something, because I woke up a day later in triage with several broken ribs and a fractured collarbone with no memory of anything that happened right after that. I never saw Officer Frederick Henry or those soldiers ever again during my time, if that was even his real name, and I often wonder what those guys were doing back there. Maybe they were trying to gather intelligence from dead enemy soldiers or something. Either way, it was a strange experience that I'll never forget. Thanks for watching the video. Subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications to watch the latest videos.